All right, guys, welcome to episode 8 of the Data Driven Strength podcast. Today we have a very special guest. Dr. Eric Helms is with us today. We're going to be discussing kind of the topic going off of our last conversation with Mike Tushir, maybe taking it on a little bit of a different side of the conversation with Dr. Helms. We're going to be discussing how can periodization and individualization kind of coexist as concepts. We often discuss periodization conceptually and then also how important individualization is. And a lot of the time, I think these are viewed as mutually exclusive concepts, but I don't think that's really the case. And we're kind of going to go into the weeds on that today. So without further ado, let me pull up my outline here because I didn't have it up. So Dr. Helms, kind of the first question we want to kind of dig in with you is where do you particularly draw the line in the sand? I think that's kind of a common phrase that we kind of use in this kind of discussion in terms of, we'll be referencing kind of probably Mike's terminology in this a lot, but he seems to draw the line in the sand at the kind of the microcycle level when we're looking to kind of begin this conversation of what are we using as our unit of training to kind of individualize from. Based on your kind of background, which I think is pretty similar to ours, we maybe rely on the research maybe a little bit more than Mike does, which isn't to say one approach is right or wrong. It's just simply kind of our lens in which we view things from. We're just kind of interested, where do you draw that line in the sand based on that experience and kind of the way that you look at training and kind of look to solve these problems?
Yeah, so that's a really great preamble. And I think I am getting data at the microcycle level, but I don't repeat the same microcycle without any changes. Um, I really have, especially when we're talking about power lifters, I really have started to more consistently include singles at some RPE that is 5 or more, at least once a week for the lifts that we're working on, unless some individual circumstances prevent, preclude, or contraindicate that. And I think that is just really helpful because it gives you a constant quote unquote finger on the pulse. Um, that said, I think you can do that while having a mesocycle as your base unit, and still get an idea of how it's progressing. Um, and if it's progressing to the way you expect, like, okay, I'm pushing volume on day 2, but I've got a single on day 3. I'm expecting that single to be a little suppressed. Is it or is it not? Interesting. If it's not what I expected. What does that mean? Does that give me a pathway to explore in the future? So, it's difficult to talk about this without kind of starting with some constraints as to maybe what we're comparing it to. But so, for example, Mike likes to keep the rep targets the same. He basically keeps the microcycle the same, and then lets load change. And that tells you whether or not load is going in the direction you want or not, or how long the time to peak, all the concepts and terminology he uses. I love that. And I think it's certainly a valid way of going. That said, I do think that let's put it this way. I'm not concerned if I was to go from sets of 6 sets to 5 sets to 4, 3 weeks in a row. I just don't see why that would be so different, such as to remove a level of diagnostic clarity that isn't worth the potential benefits of that more linear approach, I guess you will. So, like you guys, because I'm an uber nerd, and I'm constantly staying on top of the research and also evaluating how much of it has direct applicability and a high probability of being generalizable in a beneficial way to people. There are certain, I guess, my line in the sand where I start is with a few other things. I tend to precede intensity blocks with volume blocks because I do think that having more muscle mass will probably lead towards better strength down the line. I do tend to have a general linearity when I'm moving towards a meet, especially with rep targets going down and RPEs creeping up a half point week to week on singles, for example. I do tend to have more accessory work and less accessory work as we shift into doing more intensity and more specific work and needing to do multiple sets of 2s and 3s and 4s that take more time. And I'm thinking about the opportunity cost of how much effort and time that the lifter can put into their training on each given day. Um, and yeah, I tend to default to some of those things that, in my experience and based on my interpretation of the data, have a pretty good chance of being effective, a low chance of a downside. But I'm also acutely aware, and I almost solely credit Mike T to this, in the times we've chatted and the conferences we've done together and things like that, that now I think about it from the lens of, okay, well, do the assumptions I make and the system I set up and the way I start, can the diagnostic information I take, or I get rather, um, does that prevent, could I actually get from where I start to something that is quite different? And I think that is the litmus test, is that wherever you start on that paradigm, or that continuum, I guess you could call it, you need to be able to get to somewhere else to say that it is truly like the individualization fix. You know, if you can't tell the I guess the quote unquote potentiation effects of a volume block for an intensity block, if volume blocks go poorly in terms of enhancing your estimated 1RM, but they do have a multiplicative effect on what you'd get on the subsequent intensity block, can you tell that? That would be the question I would ask to someone who wants to take a little more bare bones microcycle based approach. Um, Likewise, the question I ask myself is that with the assumptions I have in place, could I find someone who is the exception to the rule, and in a reasonable time frame, I get them closer to something that would be beneficial? So that was a long answer, but that is my answer.
Excellent. I think we admittedly have similar biases, like Zach alluded to at the beginning, and we probably have a pretty similar practical application and a similar conceptualization of how to approach these things. So you kind of discussed some of the week-to-week changes you're willing to make, as well as maybe proceeding an intensification phase by a volume focused phase. Are you consciously accepting a lack of signal and if so, to what degree? And do you think this actually matters in a practical sense?
For sure. So I think the way I look at it is I have metrics. I think the thing we have to acknowledge is that we have assumptions about what is a reasonable rate of progress. We have assumptions about what type of response we should have after what we think is a fatiguing session. And our ability to diagnose those assumptions is essentially matching an expectation that is not, valid really when you think about it. It's our best guess at what should be happening, and then our ability to gauge reality of, is it happening, and then to hopefully guess the causes. Is this actually getting weaker, actually getting stronger, or just low or high fatigue? You really don't know. So I think I don't know necessarily that I'm accepting a lack of signal. It's that I'm expecting to not have a big signal for moving that estimated 1RM based off that single that is 5 to 7 RPE in a volume block. And given in my experience that pushing a more strength focused approach with higher RPE singles, more frequent singles, and not as high volume training overall, that to me, my experience has been that has a pretty short time limit before you start to see stagnation. In most cases, that's, in my experience, 3 to 8 weeks. So if someone comes to me and goes, right, I got to meet in 3 to 8 weeks, I know what we're doing. It's going to be something that's a lot of singles, a lot of high RPEs, and a lot of low rep work, and a lot of specificity. And hopefully, I'm gauging things to make sure we don't start to flatline before we're too far from the meet, where the taper can't really kind of bridge us there, and I don't want to go limping in. So the question that I think of is, well, all right, if I am truly getting a lower signal from non-specific strength training, like, what do I do? I mean, like, if I give them a high signal, they plateau, right? So if I just run successive strength blocks, We see stagnation, burnout, injury, or just a plateau, with slight regression. And, I've heard of people who, and actually, probably the most experienced person in this is Dr. Zerdos himself, who's ran multiple months of, working to a max every day. And he can tell you that you get highly variable training responses, periods of just dead times where you're not progressing, and then kind of this nonlinear increase. So you can grind through it. I'm not necessarily confident that is an optimal approach. It's certainly not a fun approach, and I don't think it would be an approach that most people would sustain. But I guess the thought experiment I go to is, all right, if I can't just push intensity with any kind of predictability of more predictable increases in 1RM, then what do I do? So the way I look at it is when I have a volume block, I am running that with the expectation that it would be nice if we kind of held on to strength and any gains or extra credit. And I would like to see non-specific improvements in performance, being able to add more reps, seeing RPEs creep down in accessory work, and seeing strength gains in different rep ranges, things like that. And I push that to the point where, again, we start to see, because you get stagnation on anything, right? It's not unique to a strength block. I push that until we get a little bit of stagnation there. And then we just have a less intensive intensity block if we're, far from competition, a little more intensive deload. And that sounds, counterintuitive based on what I'm saying. What I mean is like a much easier time frame, like a week of training twice or 3 times, like post meet, like just kind of chilling basically, but do whatever you feel like you want to do before then going into a block of kind of that whole thing ratcheted up a little bit with intensity or loads. So that's kind of the way I physically work in and out of training. And I find that produces, if you take a step back, a much more predictable strength path where strength ekes up and then it starts to go up more obviously when you're more specific. It drops down a very slight amount, but you're not going down to where you started, and you kind of have these wave-like increases in strength over time. And so I guess you could say that I'm accepting a lower signal, but I would say that that's not the way I think about it. I think about it from the frame of mind of I'm getting the signal I expect, because I don't know what the alternative would be, because I don't think I can just push something that is high signal all the time.
Yeah, I think we definitely have a similar practical approach, but to kind of play devil's advocate for the listener that might disagree with what you're saying and what we're agreeing with, I guess the question would be, how do you know, or if we think about that wave-like pattern of strength increases out over time, how do we know what works within that wave-like pattern? Because to me, within individualization, there are countless things, and Bryce Lewis put up an excellent write-up on this recently. And one of these factors is the sequence of training blocks. And to me, that's really hard to detect. Where's the magic happening here? Is it an individual block or is it the sequence of blocks? Because and I think I speak for both Zach and I here, we think there is something to, the second order effects, and that will net you greater gains in the long term. But just from a high level point of view, is in practice, how can you get some indicators as to, is it something specifically happening in one of those blocks? Is it the sequence of blocks? Can they stand alone, et cetera? So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, because we are kind of making the assumption that a bigger muscle is a stronger muscle, which I think we would all agree with, and Mike would agree with, but you're also putting your eggs in that basket, which might be a downside. So it always fascinates me how Mike will adamantly agree about that. And he's not gonna push you on that, but he's also saying, I'm not going to put all my eggs in that basket, because if I do, I could be missing out on something. And if a bigger muscle is a stronger muscle, we're going to land on a microcycle that results in that. And I have things set up so that emerges in the short term, and I can detect that and run with it and follow that path. So again, I'm not totally agreeing with what I'm saying, but just to kind of play devil's advocate is, how do you detect whether the sequence of blocks is actually netting you more gains in the long term?
It's a fantastic question. And I think there are some really salient points there. And that if you do have, Mike says I have a system to detect that. And I can think of many instances where someone biased more towards um, a more volume, higher rep approach would just be better across the board, depending on what their individual bottleneck is for strength versus someone else who is, let's say, an advanced lifter at a high level, where there's almost I think there's a resource problem to where you can't effectively focus on hypertrophy while maintaining that highly advanced level of strength you have, which requires a little more specific focus on that. At least that's been my experience, is that if I take someone who's pretty strong, we'll say not just like an advanced lifter, but I would say a over 400 Wilks power lifter. We'll say something like that to kind of give some kind of reference point that is across sexes and weight classes. That's not crazy, but that's really, really strong compared to the general public, and in those cases, it's just very difficult to find, in my experience, a microcycle that does it all. And I think if you do land on something like that, I think like your question to me, playing devil's advocate, is we have to ask, could you be doing something that's better? And I don't think we ever get to know that answer, to be honest. There's a great quote by Dan John, who's by no means like a super hardcore scientist, but he's very logical. And he said, when it comes to coaching, if it worked, I'm right. And that's it, because that's really all you have. And I think athletes at a certain point, if they progress and they are starting to get reasonably good relative to where they can go, at a certain point, they do value just progress, not better or worse progress. There's a finite time period in most athletes' careers where they get to be that, like that picky. And it's when they can make gains from almost anything. I'm like, well, I want to gain 20 kilos, not 10 on my squat in the next mesocycle. And it's like, okay, well, there's going to be a point when 20 kilos is maybe all you have left in your whole career for what you can add to your lift. So if you progress and you can measure it, you're happy. So I think if any system which results in plateaus being able to be broken and moving forward is great, but you do have to be able to actually detect that. So how do I detect it? It is probably a very similar answer to what Mike T would tell you, in that you have to watch certain metrics and then see if there's patterns that emerge. And if you are using successive blocks, like if you're doing a volume block, an intensity block, a taper block, and then an extended deload, does it produce progress? And here's the thing, I think the individualization piece is really key here, is, do you see consistent patterns within blocks, right? So if you were to take somebody and you have your stock standard approach and you go, 6 weeks, 4 weeks, 1 week, in that example I gave, right? 6 weeks, 4 weeks, 1 week, 1 week. We'll say taper in a little deload. And you consistently notice that they're progressing really well in the 5th and 6th week of your volume block, and then you decide to go to intensity block, I would do that once if we had a meet, because I don't have any other prior data. But if I did it again and that happened again, I would go, let's go to week 7 on the volume block, So I think my system, I think I have to admit and be honest that when I start with that block system, it is very difficult to get out of it completely. Unless, you could say, all right, well, extend it to block 7, at the block to week 7, and then week 8, and then week 9. Like, they just made really good kind of linear progress with more volume. And that might change the ratio, but eventually they would plateau, right? And then I go, okay, they plateaued. We ran 10 weeks of volume. We're going to do a deload / intro into intensity. Then we'll do intensity. Oh, that only worked for 3 weeks. Then we do taper. That is definitely something I can get to, and I have gotten to with athletes, where my typical setup has become much more dominated by one phase or another. And I think the only case in which I would just go volume the whole time was be if I went to the intensity block and they stagnated and then I tapered. Then I'd be like, well, why is the intensity block here? Let me just bring the taper in. And then if the taper results in just stagnation, it's like, well, why am I tapering? I should just train into this meet. So I do think that can happen. There's nothing in my system that would prevent that, but I think Mike would probably get there faster, if I'm honest, based on my understanding of how he does things. I don't know, though, that is a trade-off that's worth it in all cases. And I think that is something you just have to think about, is like, if there's this, and you could go even further than Mike. You could have just a single session. You could have not the microcycle, but the session be your unit of training. And I think there's problems with that. So, you can have the whole spectrum from an individual session all the way to, a macro cycle. And you can do it like, old school, not even old school, but some philosophies of periodization. I will not name names, but if you were to take their courses, read their books, or see some of their research, they have a macro cycle built for everyone. Everyone needs an annual plan. Or you're a power lifter, you compete 3 times a year. Yeah, you need an annual plan, but annual plan, I can forecast your strength in October 3rd next year. Okay, sure you can. So I think that is kind of the continuum I see that is possible. And I think there are problems associated with either far end of that spectrum, to where it's really difficult when you have this hyper organized, super planned, multiple successive potentiation blocks. When you take a theoretical model, it's a model, and we know that all models are wrong, but some are useful, right? So the more assumptions we pump into it and the more layers we have, yeah, if you value individualization and monitoring and auto-regulation, you can start unpeeling those layers. But if you have to go through like 15 layers, it's going to be a long time before that exception to your rule actually finds progress. So you kind of have to be in the middle, right? You have to have a good tool set for monitoring and assessing the individual, auto-regulating and allow for changing, good communication to get some of the subjective things that might not be picked up in the quantitative data, and then start where you're comfortable somewhere in the middle. And I think it's very difficult to, beyond, at least I can't think of a way to come to a better answer than that philosophically, than that. I think what that looks like, you could absolutely find some different applications and logistical tools, and what's a better way of monitoring. Do you use video? Do you get a velocity tracker, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, high level, like you asked, that's kind of where I sit.
That was a really, really good response. I'm going to just kind of mention some things that came to mind for me. Josh, you can tie it up and kind of maybe direct it a little bit more if what I'm saying is a little bit sporadic. But I think one of the things that I really identified with was that an approach I often use is similar to you. Like I have like kind of a stock block structure in mind. That's kind of if somebody's going to come with me for 12 weeks and I have a meet on week 12, and that's kind of what I'm going to roll with to start. And one thing we often talk about is like, although, like you said, all models are limited in some way. And I think having familiarity with a model, even though it does have flaws, I think you can become very experienced with the blind spots that your model has. And I also think that can help you circumvent those blind spots to a certain degree. So I think, if you were to sporadically change your approach all the time, the reality is all of those are going to have their own limits. But if you're consistently using one approach, although there obviously are blind spots to a certain approach, you can kind of get around those to a certain degree if you're very, very familiar with them. And so one thing I really like that you said was, oftentimes when you have this block structure that's somewhat linear in nature, you can kind of look at the whatever metrics you're associating with progress in that given phase, which I think is another conversation we can kind of touch on, because I do think that can be different depending on the goal in training that we're actually talking about. Because one thing I always ask myself is like, I'm 7 months from competition. Is estimated 1RM really what I care about at that time? And is that guaranteed to track with what's going to make me the strongest in 7 months, not in 2 months? I think that's a philosophical question I often ask myself. But what I was kind of saying is, once you've decided what progress means for that time period, you can have this linear sequential kind of block structure. And I think you kind of get to a similar spot that you would from more of a microcycle approach, because they're going to test 3 different blocks that are going to be, arranged in some pattern. Ours are probably just going to follow this linear pattern. And then we can take the individual rates of gain in each of those blocks and say, okay, block 2 seemed to be a little bit faster rate of gain than block 3. That's generally not what I would expect for this metric. The next cycle, let's keep this same linear pattern, because at the end of the day, I have to make an assumption. And this seems to be coherent with what I believe in terms of a bigger muscle and all that stuff we touched on earlier. I'm willing to take that assumption, but let's kick the entire cycle down in that direction a little bit. So let's say block B has the best rate of gain. That's going to be generally a bit higher volume, maybe a little bit lower intensity on average. Let's try this exact same setup. Let's just kick everything down a bit. So maybe the first volume block that you're running, maybe not to say strength endurance, but maybe it looks a little bit more on that continuum. And so you have the same, benefits of periodization that often aren't talked about in terms of, like you said, lack of burnout because we're switching things up regularly, having some sense of momentum because things are kind of building to a point, and all the psychological kind of soft skills I think that periodization gives you benefits for. We still have those, but we're also acknowledging the fact that this block seemed to have a faster rate of gain in the metric that we care about. So let's acknowledge that, but we can still maintain the integrity of the kind of the periodized model that we kind of seem to come to the conclusion that that's a safe bet in most cases. That was kind of something I thought, Josh. I don't know if you want to add anything there.
Yeah, I have a few things I'll chat about briefly, and then I'll hopefully head us in a somewhat of a cohesive direction. I think listening to both you guys talk, something that I would echo is that this is a long-term process. The individualization process. Like I kind of the time frame that I feel I finally have a kind of like a base training cycle for an individual where I think I can get reliable and repeatable results is like a year or 2 at least. And from there, 2 years later, it might be a lot different. But I think, like Zach said, if you have a system, I think what's more important than what your system is whether or not you have a system, because then you can start picking up on those consistent patterns that Dr. Helms was talking about. Oh, it looks like, for the last 3 training cycles, when we deloaded in week 7, we saw this spike in week 8. What kind of indication is this about how you respond to a short-term decrease in training volume? Oh, we also saw that when we taper, we haven't been getting a ton out of your peaks. Oh, but the peaks have been 2 weeks long. Maybe you get a really nice spike in performance in the short term. So maybe our peak into a meet down the road is just 1 power day and then the meet. So you just kind of pick up on these indicators over time. And it's very long-term, because you might only get, for like that example I just used, you might get 6, 7, 8 data points of like that will give you clues about that in a whole year. And you're just kind of playing a guessing game and continuously chasing your tail. So I guess what I would echo is to use your system and standardize things. And then you get to a point where it's reliable and repeatable. And then at that point, you're just kind of testing the waters, dipping your toes into other options, and then just making adjustments based on athlete preference and keeping them engaged, et cetera. So that's kind of my ramble to agree with you guys. Hopefully the listener was able to follow there. The next thing I want to echo that Dr. Helms talked about, I really like the way you framed the resource problem and that kind of giving us grounds for periodization. The way we like to frame it is that we're kind of making some assumptions, right? And I think that is a sacrifice, but at some point you're willing to make that sacrifice if you're sure enough of the assumption is that if you can maximize the short-term rate of hypertrophy, that's going to set you up in a better spot down the line. And again, we're acknowledging that's an uncertainty to some degree, right? We don't technically have the evidence to say that's the case, but we have the correlational data, we have the anecdotal indicators to say that's the case. So we are making that assumption. And at the very least, it's like you guys both mentioned, some of the psychological benefits of adjusting the short-term goal, etc. So again, I think the resource problem is a really good way to kind of frame it. Okay, now to get into the weeds a little bit, I think what's interesting to talk about, and this might get into some things that Zach and I have been discussing recently that we'd be interested to get your thoughts on, is when we think about whether or not we see a positive training response, just from, again, I'm asking you a lot of high level questions, but like what actually drives that response to training? What are I guess kind of the big hitters that we want to make sure are in check? Because I said earlier, there are infinite things we can adjust and infinite combinations. So what are the things we should be focusing on? And yeah, I guess that's really it. What are the big hitters in terms of individualization that should be the focus?
Talking about training variables or physiological adaptations?
I
I
think
think
it's,
yes.
yeah, I was gonna say, I think just to add a little bit more detail to that, I think like it's very easy to take this into the direction of like, well, yes, you need to have intensity in this direction, volume in this direction, but I think like conceptually, I guess I'm just gonna spoil our position, Josh, because I think that's the best way to kind of add our context onto this. But at the end of the day, I kind of have like this mental model that everything goes into what I'm just going to call the total training dose. So ultimately, what I believe creates the divergent response in individuals is that all three of us in this call can handle a different dose. And so that's a culmination of intensity, volume, exercise selection, proximity to failure, rest intervals. All of that comes into this concept of total training dose. If I'm going to do more volume, that's more dose. If I do more external load, that's more dose. If I choose squats over leg extensions, that's also more dose. The point being, it goes along right what you were talking about early on, Dr. Helms, in saying that you don't really think that sixes versus fives versus fours at a similar intensity like bracket. It just physiologically doesn't make sense to me that is going to create an inherently different response between individuals. The adaptations to resistance training seem to be relatively flushed out, although that's debatable to some degree. It just doesn't make sense to me why that would be inherently different. But what does make sense to me that would be inherently different is the fact that all of these variables come together in what I'm going to call total training dose, and that there's multiple configurations of a program that I would say each of these variables maybe has like a different value. So maybe volume is a quarter and rest intervals is a penny, but there's a total dollar amount that each individual can handle, which is going to result in multiple programs that can give them a very, very good outcome, but it has to be within their dose requirements. So you can have too much dose and that's going to lead to a maladaptive response, or you can have far too little dose and that's a subadaptive response. And to me, that makes a lot of sense why we see divergent responses, but it also doesn't pigeonhole us into saying that this individual responds to fives on a pin squat and nothing else, because that to me has always never really sat right with me. And I'm not saying that, you know, Mike, for example, I don't think he would hold to that opinion. So I'm not trying to mischaracterize him. I'm just saying that to me is a logical extension of some of these kind of bottom up models to some degree, is say, I respond to fives on pin squat, but I do not respond to sixes on pause squats. That to me just doesn't sit well. But what I think can kind of captures that is this kind of total training dose. So hopefully that kind of gives a little bit more context, and maybe you can kind of tell me where I'm missing something, poke some holes in it, or kind of give your 2 cents.
No, I think that's helpful framing. And I think that's a useful paradigm of the way of looking at it. But I think it's actually even a little more black box than that. So a given training session has simultaneous fatigue effects, positive adaptive effects, and priming effects, which is very confusing. So there is acute non-chronic adaptations that might make you stronger within some time frame, some combination of PAP and priming that we don't really know what exactly optimizes it when, but we know it's a thing because we have enough studies that show it. And there is also individual fatigue responses. At least that's what it seems like, in that I've seen some people who burn out on volume, and I've seen other people who burn out on loads a lot more. Some people who can handle more consistent singles, and this may just be what they like doing. They've done it a lot. They're adapted to it. But the output of what I see as a coach who gets someone for a certain number of mesocycles rather than kind of living their whole training experience in life, is that the fatigue responses are also individual. So that dose, maybe it's very similar between people, but what is affecting the output and what it seems like is those, priming and fatigue things. It could just as well likely be that some people respond better to volume and intensity, and it's not a fatigue difference, or it's both, which I'd probably guess if I had to guess. So absolutely, it's a black box, but I do think just thinking of the whole thing as a training dose is useful. And I think you're right that if you go really hardcore down the bottom up philosophical chain and you kind of carry it out to maybe what I call illogical extension, because I think we are playing devil's advocate. We're not trying to pigeonhole Mike. And I really, really do like Mike's approach, to be clear. I think you could draw inferences between these associations that I'm a fives on the pause squat guy, and because you don't have an alternate reality where you subbed in something similar to those 5 pause squats, where it wasn't, fives on pin squats, you don't know that could have been something else of a similar response. And I think it's logical to conclude that there is probably a range of things that will give an effectively similar response, but we can't test them all simultaneously. So I think you have to get really comfortable with the uncertainty around either approach with what you're doing. And that can be paralyzing, but it can also be a good internal litmus test to figure out, well, is what I'm doing pigeonholing me, or is it giving me options? And is it giving me so many options I feel like I'm intimidated, or does it give me some useful constraints? Going back to what you said earlier about having a model, having a system is very important, because then within the system, you can find its blind spots. My system has changed over time. I remember when I used to write 8-week blocks and just be like, all right, let's run that, and each one had a little bit of linearity to it and a deload in the middle. So the first one was more volume based. The last, 3 weeks was more intensity based, mini deload, and then, mini taper, I guess you could say, then test. And I would just kind of basically wait 8 weeks to make a decision based on those 1RMs. That was pre-using RPE, and that was doing things like looking at session RPE, because that is something I use to gauge, here's how hard I think this block should be, or sorry, day should be, and how hard did you experience it. And me using singles throughout a block. And now that I've brought in those other monitoring tools, I feel much more comfortable with my default being a 3-week mesocycle with a potential deload based on a post-block assessment of subjectively of how are you doing. So that allows me to make inferences, at least I think, equally good, or if not better inferences from a much shorter period of time that I've landed on than previously, and not just pitting everything on that one day where we tested maxes. Like what if throughout week 7, your estimated 1RMs were better, and then you just had a bad day when you tested? I mean, that's like one obvious thing, but there's a lot that could come from, having a different system. So yeah, I don't know if I answered any questions there, but I would say that it's a really interesting discussion. And I largely agree that I think when you start to be overly reductionist and you think about specific variables, and I know this is more catered towards the hypertrophy side of it, but some of the stuff around like maximum adaptive volume, maximal recoverable volume, minimum effective volume, it really, I think it probably at least if you apply that context to strength, I think it overemphasizes that it's the volume effect, which we know the experience can be drastically changed by manipulating frequency while keeping, microcycle volume the same. You can have a 1/5 of the delayed onset muscle soreness by just going with a one versus 3 times per week frequency, which is probably reflective to some degree of the muscle damage experience. So there's a physiological difference there as well, even though the volume is the same. So I think we do have to look at the dose in aggregate. I do agree there. And I think the one of the first things I do when I've got someone who is coming to me is, instead of making drastic changes, especially if they have experience, I think of ways of making the training more efficient. of making the throughput less costly, trying to find ways to adjust the distribution of exercises, um, the distribution of volume, the order, the days that are trained, and the frequency per lift, while still maintaining the peak intensities and total volume or similar total volume to what they're doing. And then I'll go like, all right, try that out. How did you feel? Like, were you, did you find that, day 3 you're always wrecked, and now day 3 you're all right? So that's typically where I start. Is I try to look at manipulating the variables to make the dose, the same dose, if we want to look at it like that, um, less fatiguing.
Hmm.
So I think, well, like I maintain the same paradigm. I often look at it from, all right, how are they organizing their training stress? And I normally think of training stress as like volume and intensity. I don't often think of frequency as a stress, although you certainly could, you could jam it all in the front of the week and crush yourself by day 4. You could, but I find, at least in my experience, it's more useful to kind of get back to the original question from you, Josh. Is I will look at the volume intensity for an individual based on where they've been, what they've done, where they've gotten, and their current experience, and try to assess why are they plateaued now in broad terms. Are they doing too much? Are they not doing enough? Or are they consistently getting hurt, injured, or burned out? And then, especially in cases where I think it is just a poor organization, that is too much, that could be not as stressful, my first go-to is efficiency. And when someone is not doing enough, I will also go to efficiency and figure out a way to give them more without it feeling like too much more. And when they're simply doing too much, that's when I think there's a little more of a psychological role that I have to play to make them feel comfortable doing less, and then distributing it in a way that still feels like it is a novel and sufficient stress, and try to get buy-in from the communication. So most of the time, because that's 2 out of the 3 possible scenarios, what I'm manipulating is volume distribution, lift frequency, when they're taking rest days versus training days, and potentially things outside of what's on the training spreadsheet that might enhance their recovery outside of the gym. So nutrition variables, sleep hygiene, um, you know, anabolic steroids, just kidding, like creatine, etc. So the stuff that is that can potentially make that same dose a little more tolerable. So that is those are my first few steps that I think of when I see a set of variables attached to a person, and we've had a discussion on how to move them forward.
I just want to add a little bit more, because you made me think of one more thing that like culminates into that dose that I think makes it even a muddier picture than maybe I presented it. To be clear, I don't think it's a one size fits all like kind of pot thing. I just think that's the most useful conceptualization I've come to like how I don't give myself paralysis by analysis. Um, the other thing is that you mentioned to some degree is the psychological role of like how the athlete views the training and their expectations leading up to it. I think a lot of times, especially the people that are familiar with like periodization, how that's supposed to go, what it's supposed to feel like. If they're really bought into like just sipping the evidence-based Kool-Aid hard, like this is how you train, like kind of thing. And their just expectations are so high when that strength block comes, because that's what they're expecting. Like that is when the strength gains come, because that's what it says on the spreadsheet. And I think that adds another layer of interpretation that coach has to go through to say like, okay, was it the dose or was it how they perceive the dose? Like it makes it a lot more difficult than maybe I not intentionally, but maybe I made it seem. And then I also think like psychological arousal and how you approach the training can also considerably make the same dose feel way harder. And then I would also put that into dose. Like if you're taking the same amount of volume with way more arousal, I would say that dose is probably higher, but the point remains the same, that like all the psychological factors still make that equation even more difficult. And all your points lead to that little black box just getting a little bit bigger and still very uncertain. So but yeah, that was just one thing I wanted to layer on there. But Josh, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to kind of take this whole dose thing that Zach talked about make maybe what seems like a bold statement that I kind of believe in, but I'm not certain of. So I'll be interested to let you guys poke holes in it. So if we take this resource problem that Dr. Helms talked about, right? If we just think of it as like a bucket, everybody has a different size bucket. Some individuals can tolerate more total dose because they're filling up. They have a bigger bucket to fill up, right? You're putting all these elements of dose into the bucket, your resource bucket. And like Dr. Helms said, for some individuals, if I give them 10 units of intensity, that's going to be whatever, 10 units of dose. But if I give another person 10 units of intensity, that might be 20 units of dose. So that's kind of how you might conceptualize it. And then the next question might be, well, then can I just do like, let's say I'm not, I don't or I don't experience a high dose from intensity. Why don't I just do 50 to 60% for all my training? That's where I get to my bold claim, is that maybe good training is just good training. And what you have to do is configure the training variables, all the different elements that feed into the total training dose. It's all a give and a take, and you're trying to give yourself the best design that fits within the parameters of good training to fill that bucket up without overflowing it, right? So we know that a single at 100% is probably your best strength practice. For person A, they might be able to do 95% every single week and be totally fine because they're barely filling up that bucket, and thus that's the best route for them. But for person B, anything over 90% is a huge dose that's going into the bucket. So thus the when we think about the give and the take, that's probably not, we're probably not going to give them a ton of work over 90% because there are other things we need to accomplish in the training session. So I'll be interested if you guys.
Oh, we're losing. Man, bold claim.
You'll be interested to know if it's the boldest I've ever heard.
Yeah, I think
run
you've
for office on something like that.
Oh,
he's back.
We lost you there for about 30 seconds, big guy.
I think I said everything I had to say.
Well, the last thing we heard was, I'd be interested to hear if you guys think.
Yes, I do think. In fact, that is confirmed.
Oh, that's what it was. Yeah.
I think I was saying if you guys are able to poke some holes into it, because, good training is good training. It might seem like a bold statement, but I think I believe it. But the crux of the whole analogy is that the different components of the dose fill up people's buckets differently. And thus that's where the different configurations of training emerge.
Yeah, just to steel man you a little bit and try to maybe conceptualize the argument in my
make Dr. Helms agree with us.
Yeah, try my best. I think the other variable to add on to that is so you're essentially saying, like in the example I gave with the money analogy, you're essentially saying that some people's volume is a quarter, but other people's volume is a penny. Like the relative contributions of that dose is different depending on the individual. And I think that is I think that's an interesting concept. I honestly was going to say something before that, but then I forgot. So I'm going to pitch it to Dr. Helms and try to remember what I was going to say. So go for it. Take the stick there on the relay team.
I will. 4x1, hopefully, because 4x4 is awful.
You were a sprinter back in the day, weren't you?
I wanted to be a sprinter, and I got turned into the barely sprinter and middle distance run. Yeah, 400 meters is just terrible.
You should have just taken the compliment. But,
Exactly. Thank you. I was a sprinter back in the day.
Right, there you go.
Yeah. So no, I like the analogy. I think, Josh, I think maybe you described what good training is. I think what might also bolster and make more relevant the analogy and maybe more accurate is that the water on the floor is the spilling over is the negative. That's excess fatigue that was too much, that's counterproductive. So therefore, in my mind, bad training is not just overfilling it, but it's spilling water on the floor without getting into the bucket.
Well said.
So for example, if someone is like, my goal, I'm going to use an extreme one just because it's easy to understand. My goal is to compete in this powerlifting meet. So I did 5 CrossFit WODs. Like, you're going to spill a whole lot of water on the floor, and you might just get a little bit in there that one time you had to do like front squats with body weight, and it maybe improved something, but not much. So I think that's a good way of looking at it. I think I agree with that as well, because we have enough data to suggest that there are various ways to improve 1RM, even that are reasonably non-specific from a powerlifter's perspective. They might have motor pattern specificity, but not load specificity, or they might have load specificity but very little volume. So depending on whatever camp you're in that you think is the most important thing, you kind of have to sit with that and be like, yeah, that group of trained athletes got stronger just doing a few singles every week and nothing else, for at least 4 to 7 weeks. Like if we look at the Androlakis Korakakis study on Greek powerlifters, or if we look at the Klemp research, which was before your guys' time in Zerdos's lab, didn't actually see a difference in strength in a group that was doing all relatively high rep work for the big three compared to a group that was doing matched volume load of lower reps. That's not a ubiquitous finding, and that it could be some sampling variance in there, and almost certainly is, as every study has. But we, even if we were comparing like a moderate effect size of like 0.5 to a small effect size of 0.3, it's not like one works and one doesn't. So I think to some degree, if you look at the research in terms of magnitudes and consistencies and all the variables that improve strength, you have to agree with Josh, in my opinion. You could say that it's an overly simplistic model, which it is because it's a model, but I think it is a useful conceptualization.
I remember what I was going to say. It's not super relevant now, but it was all I was going to say is that somebody may hear what Josh said, like good training is good training, which I also agree with. So high fives, guys. We all agree with each other. We're super cool. But what I was going to say is that it's not like we have it all figured out yet either. Like theoretically optimal is like this kind of cloud that we're trying to reach, but we don't exactly know. So maybe we can see the edges of it. And so like, obviously I think at this point we're pretty comfortable saying load matters for strength gains in most cases. There might be a threshold in which you get above that. It's kind of the same, but in most cases, I think we're pretty confident with that, but it's not like we have like, this is the perfect program, and then we look for small deviations from there. It's like, there is like this theoretically, based on the research and what seems to be the best for most of the averages that we've looked at. This is kind of what we're looking at. And then from, their tolerance and their dose, and then the rate at which they fatigue and all the stuff that we've mentioned so far, then we kind of start making changes. But one thing me and Josh have mentioned a few times is like, we don't want people, whoops, that was my mother. Sorry, mom. One thing we've mentioned a few places is like, we don't want people to view that as like you're deviating from optimal, because working within your constraints is optimal. So it's like, you're not just trying to get this perfect program and then any deviations from there is automatically worse. It's that these are the principles that we guide ourselves by. And then when we have individual constraints, that's when that overrides it. And that is what is optimal. So again, kind of not super relevant at this point, but go for it.
Like I said, if you kind of agree with us so far that maybe good training is good training, okay, where's this good training program? First of all, we don't have it. And second of all, even if we did have it, it wouldn't be useful because of like what Zach said. It's not moving within your constraints becomes more optimal, not less optimal. So hopefully that kind of covers us a little bit in terms of some bold claims there. Zach, do you have any direction you want to take this? If not,
by the way, I just want to say your bold claim. I mean, I'd be impressed if you still have followers after this.
Wow.
Just the
fake news. Am I right?
Yeah, the level of zealotry. You're just an ideologue, really. I like to frame evidence-based practice, and this will work for Americans, as if you have walked out onto the baseball field, it's evidence-based practice. But then the batter responding to the pitch they get thrown is everything else. And you don't really get to know until you swing. and it's your best guess on what's coming down the pipe. That's kind of like the individualization process. Um, and the experience of becoming more advanced is like you're regressing as a baseball player while the pitcher is eventually becoming Nolan Ryan, and you're now moving towards like a little leaguer, and you're missing most of the time, and it's very difficult to tell whether you're swinging right or not. But I think the and this is far beyond the scope of what we wanted to talk about. One of the issues with the quote unquote kind of evidence-based community is that the being evidence-based, quote unquote, has many times replaced the gurus of old, which make hyperbolic claims and suggest that if you do X, Y, and Z, follow my program, believe in me, bow before the muscular person on your Instagram, that you will get great gains. And that is replaced with, oh, get that guy out of here. That's bro science. I'm going to do the exact same thing with whatever's latest on Stronger by Science or PubMed or that I post or whatever. And I think by the time most people come to be evidence-based, they're already on the baseball field. And I think that's a tough realization that you're probably an intermediate. You are probably already doing things mostly right. And now you're looking to fine tune things. You're looking to improve the efficiency, like I talked about before. Maybe picking a few spots where you're like, oh, I was doing that, and that actually doesn't really make sense. And you might see a nice little mini renaissance of progress in that one little domain. But most of the time, you are now committing yourself towards incorporating scientific data into the process of individualization and getting away from kind of the program hopping stock standard stuff that you were running before. And even if you do everything perfectly and hypothetically optimal, which you can't even know that you did, you are rate limited. And we're discussing the differences between maybe small and medium effect sizes. And I think that is such an important acceptance that you have to get to, so that you don't go back to program hopping because you just haven't been getting the juice for the squeeze for a while, and you think there's something wrong. So I think managing expectations is always really, really important in these conversations. And knowing that as you go down this rabbit hole, it increases the complexity and it results in a smaller change. And that's why sometimes online you'll see someone yelling at people in the evidence-based community because they're arguing over variables that quote unquote don't matter. But I think the reality is that yes, while 95% of people who are following strength content are trying to get somewhere, like I talked about, at least having a 400 Wilks, they're not there yet. They don't even need to worry about it. But it is incredibly challenging to get from a 400 Wilks to a 430 Wilks. And most people can never get beyond a 430 Wilks. And if they can, that's what we call, an elite of some varying degrees, because they're people with, well over 500 kind of skill levels. And that is, that's an important distinction and something that I often always will caveat when we talk about this stuff, but I know it is pretty much off topic.
I'm going to go with the off-topic trend here with one question, then I'll try to bring it back to my real question. But I often actually have heard Jeff Nipper talk about this kind of analogy before, Dr. Helms, and I'd be curious to get your take on it. So I agree with you that, often, these small effect sizes are overstated and gets people to, lose the forest for the trees is obviously an analogy that people say all the time. But do you think there is hope in what I'm going to call like the stacking chips effect? So like we know that there is, these are all small effects, and that's the reality. But the hope for the quote unquote evidence-based nerd is that, in the caveat being, we don't know if these small effects are additive, and one might negate another. And so the benefits may not be like, if we have a bunch of 2% effects, it may not end up being 20% if I add 10 of them together, because they might not be additive. But nonetheless, like protein timing, for example, periodizing your training potentially, including some specific work year round, like these little small things that we think might have an effect. I kind of have solace in the fact that maybe there's a stacking the chips effect, and these little small effects stacked together can actually make a meaningful difference. And that's kind of the other side to the coin that I would often like to point out, but maybe you don't agree with that. I'm curious what you think.
I would 100% agree with it. And I would say that there are examples of this happening. I can't remember which Olympics, but the British cycling team took a data-driven approach towards improving their performance, and it's endurance sport. And I'm not at all an expert, and I read this article years ago, so I could be spreading fake news, but I can also bolster with some anecdotal
Josh would
experience
get
with a
behind
run.
it, so I'm sure.
There you go. He's with his bold claims. He's about all the fake news. So that's an example where they had some nutritional variables, some tracking and monitoring variables, some supplementation that they did, and they were able to see meaningful improvements in elite performers, but sub-medal stand, and did actually quite well in the subsequent Olympics. Another common experience that we had at 3D Muscle Journey in the realm of bodybuilding is earlier on when I'm not going to say we caused it, but there was less of a zeitgeist towards adopting more of these practices in bodybuilding, and there's a little more tradition. We would quite frequently get people who were doing more than a handful of things in what is almost certainly a suboptimal way, but had also achieved a high level in natural bodybuilding due to hard work, consistency, genetic talent, and doing enough right. That saying, success leaves clues. The only clues it really leaves is that whatever they're currently doing is not preventing success. And interestingly enough, we take on these people, and they're late 30s, early 40s, been in the game, and they have a new phase of progress. For example, within the first couple years of Jeff being incorporated and starting a 3D Muscle Journey together, his stage weight went up 10 pounds. And it wasn't necessarily that he put on a crap ton of muscle in the off season. It was just he was much better able to maintain it. And doing a lot of things that did absolutely stack those chips. And that's not an isolated occurrence. That's something that we've seen in maybe even hundreds of athletes at this point over the last decade of working at 3D Muscle Journey. And I've seen parallels as well in powerlifting. It's just more obvious in my mind for bodybuilding, because if you're working with a whole bunch of USAPL powerlifters, like a lot of them are kind of already sipping the Kool-Aid to some degree. It's just like, how big are the gulps? But bodybuilding, especially 5-10 years ago, was a lot more variable in what you would see, because it's a less objective sport. So that's part of it. And there is a lot more potential arenas where you can have chips to be stacked. So yeah, I agree.
Josh, got anything to add there?
No. Maybe we can hit on number 7 on the outline super quick and then wrap it up. Sound reasonable?
Yep, that totally works. I do have another question if you'd like me to roll with that, unless you're strongly
no, go for it, man.
All
go for it.
So this is kind of a conceptual question. So if we do take the assumption that the relationship between muscle size and strength is fairly strong, a system that makes sense to me is, if we're going to set up this periodization scheme where a volume or hypertrophy focus phase precedes the strength focus phase, and then there's a taper. That makes sense. What if we ran a similar structure that Mike uses within each mesocycle, optimized for the given outcome that we actually care about at that time? So maybe the kind of strength phase would look very similar to what Mike does now. But the question in my mind then becomes, how do we define the estimated 1RM of hypertrophy training? And I know that's a very difficult question to answer. So I'm not expecting, something profound here, I guess, to a great extent. But one thing Mike mentioned in our podcast with him that I just continually has rang in the back of my head for a while, and I'd love to get your kind of opinion on, is using like isometric strength to some degree. So one thing I've noticed for a while is, I didn't know what I was reading at the time, but like, all the, Stu Phillips studies where they compare 30% and 80% of 1RM, strength was always in favor of 80% of 1RM. And that's the only metric that anybody cares about, because it's dynamic strength. But pretty reliably, I was always confused before I was like really, practice with reading research, is like, why is isometric strength the same? I don't get it. Like, 80% is that's how you get stronger, bro. Like, why aren't they getting better? So I've kept that in the back of my head for a while. And I've chatted a little bit with Mike about it, and using it as a non-practice test that maybe you do at the beginning and end of every mesocycle. You'd have to do it in a similar fatigue state. Like, there's a ton of caveats that would go to that. But do you think we could use that And I actually bought a crane scale that I've been messing around with to try to figure out if there's a way to do this for each muscle group, like a chest fly, maybe, and like a leg extension, leg curl. Like you could do it. Obviously, you're trying to get as few joints involved for the muscle group you're trying to train or test. Do you think that would be a valid metric in any degree? Obviously, it's not perfect, but I'm just curious where your thoughts go in that. And then just kind of the broader point in general, what metric could we use to do emerging strategies for hypertrophy to kind of round out the cycle?
Yeah, so I have a few different things I want to say. What I do, my thoughts on isometrics, and then how I actually came to a similar thought experiment, we'll say, because I think the direct data is lacking, but the same data that you've noticed, I've noticed. So the one of the classic Schoenfeld meta-analyses, I should give some credit. They're often Krieger, the analyses themselves. So the Schoenfeld, Krieger, and a few other authors' analyses. They looked at the effect of matched volume, higher load training on strength output. And unsurprisingly, 1RMs, when you train over 60% of 1RM, go up more, right? And if you look at the forest plot for hypertrophy, pretty much straight down the line, it's all kind of right around the midline, no difference. And when you look at the forest plot for isometric strength, same thing. So it's not just a couple Stu Phillips studies. It's like all of them, or at least the aggregate finding in the field, is probably a better way to say that, is that isometric strength is probably not load dependent. Maybe if you trained isometrically, I could see that perhaps being a thing.
Yep.
And I think this is one of those things where you probably wouldn't want to train it. So you don't have these, I don't know, whatever the specific isometric strength outcomes would be, but it's a remote possibility that could confound things. Now, what we don't have though is to actually run correlations. So we know that isometric strength seems to go up symmetrically to different loadings, but we don't actually have like, hey, what's the relationship between, we do, but not a lot of it, between isometric strength and hypertrophy. There are some little itty bitty hints in the data that I've seen at different times that maybe single joint work and the volume performed in multiple sets could be related to hypertrophy. But I would say it definitely makes sense. And I was nodding my head when I listened to your guys' podcast with Mike T, that if you can remove some of the skill component, it will get a little closer. Not that there aren't other adaptations that are morphological in nature and maybe even neurological in nature that may be associated with higher loads that would be non-hypertrophy. But it is absolutely something worth experimenting. I have no idea if it's valid. I think that would be a cool series of studies to conduct, though, and I think I would love them to be done because I want to know. Now, as far as what I do in volume blocks is I generally look at accessory work performance, not necessarily estimated 1RM. The estimated 1RM, I basically am looking at decay or happy maintenance or happy going up, kind of thing. And if it's dropping too much, then I think about maybe doing the singles at a slightly higher RPE or slightly higher frequency, or blending in a quote unquote strength there or what have you. And that again is kind of that whole resource problem, which I think is the best way to frame periodization. Is the whole rationale for undulating periodization is I don't want to lose this when I do that. So, but anyway, so I am looking at estimated 1RM during a volume block, but it is not the way I gauge the success of the block. It is potentially the way I gauge the counterproductiveness of it while also being successful what it's trying to do. But the way I gauge the volume blocks of efficacy is if I am seeing performance and accessory work go up, and sometimes what I'm increasing in a volume block might actually be volume. So are they tolerating increases in sets here and there? And I do actually care a little bit about, depending on the person and what they're comfortable with and what we're assessing, if we're seeing subjective increases in muscularity, So I know when I run volume blocks myself, I enjoy brushing my teeth with my shirt off a lot more than on an intensity block. So I think that is probably not all in my head. And I think that could be something that's tracked to some degree. There could be some measurements. That could be just, the glycogen associated with doing more volumes. But I don't know if that's necessarily a confounder that doesn't have a positive benefit and isn't associated with what you're trying to accomplish. So I typically look at, for hypertrophy, just in general, I look at visual changes, performance changes like we talked about, and in general, I am also looking at some scale weight metric, not huge gains, but scaled to their experience level. So if all those metrics are going up at the same time, they are visually appearing or reporting. If I'm not collecting that data, because that's getting half naked pictures from your clients is not always something that is easily sold to powerlifters. But for bodybuilders, if I am seeing visual changes, scale weight changes, and performance changes going in the same direction, and occasionally something like skin fold or a circumference measurement, but it really depends on what they have access to, how well they can do it, and reliably on their own. If those are all heading in the same direction, or most of them, I see that as a successful block.
The way you kind of conceptualize, what indicators are pointing in this direction, you gave the example of performance on accessory work. If that's heading in the right direction, oh, but you have this confounder of, this is the first block, we've trained this consistently, we have to keep that in mind. So this is a good sign, but I'm not going to go solely with that. I'm also going to look at some of the visual changes. Did I get more compliments about the way I look in a t-shirt, etc.? I think a lot of those things can be undervalued. And where I was going with that is, it's very similar to how we kind of assess the overall effectiveness of a training cycle. Going back to, the example I gave of, okay, every time after we deload, we see this short-term spike. Also, with the way we peak, we kind of feel better here as opposed to there, etc. It's just all these different vectors pointing in a certain direction, and that's why it takes time, because you need to accumulate all that data, and make your best guess with the data presented. Before we wrap up here, is there anything, Zach or Dr. Helms, you guys want to add?
Nope.
I'm happy to go to number 7. Whatever
Awesome.
that was.
Awesome. I think Zach's topic.
I don't even know, no idea what it is. I'm just curious.
Zach's topic was better, but I actually think it's a pretty good way to wrap up here.
Yeah, it is.
So basically, what we thought might be interested to briefly talk about is how. So you kind of have your starting point based on the top-down framework you choose to use. How far outside of this starting point should your bounds be? And is it okay to accept some limitations here? That's basically the crux of the question. Like, at what point are you accepting, I'm never going to get there? And is that a good way to go about it in your opinion?
Yeah, and I guess I'm thinking is, would that actually be the limiter of you setting the end bounds, or is it going to be dictated by the structure of your top down? Because I think you might be comfortable theoretically with getting somewhere that is quite contrary to your structure, but the real question is, can you really get there? Like, can you really peel back all those layers to get there in the first place? And I suspect that in most cases, where you'd be comfortable getting is not going to match up with where you could get. And that's a good little thing to then reassess and be like, all right, well, then am I comfortable with my structure? And then you have to assess, like, well, what's the probability that someone is going to get stronger on tens? I think it's pretty low, so and that's okay for someone else to think differently. I guess theoretically you could have a scenario where someone really just was a strong responder to hypertrophy training. That was their bottleneck for strength. And if you only work with a fixed number of sets, yeah, a set of 10 is going to produce more hypertrophy than a set of 3. So 10s are better. That's possible. I don't know that I'd be working with a fixed number of sets. I don't know that I'd find someone who was that responsive to hypertrophy training and also that atrophied all at the same time. But I think that's the kind of thought experiment one needs to do to figure out if they're comfortable with their system. And I like how you pigeonholed me as top down right from the start, you son of a bitch. I would say I'm like
nobody's listening at this point in the podcast.
This is true. Yeah, I'm middle straight. All right, I'm not top down or bottom up. I'm the perfect middle range that makes me seem the most intelligent, rational, and optimal always. Whenever you would, by a hint to anyone, anytime there's two extreme positions, take the middle and you'll sound like a genius hipster.
Rational middle.
Even when Absolutely. Even when in reality, the whole conversation has shifted to the left or right. You just take the middle no matter what. But in all seriousness, I I definitely view it as, all right, like what have I seen? What is out there, and not just within my own coaching practice, because then you're applying a layer of bias. Um, like I've never seen someone respond to tens. Could they get to 10 in your program? No. Okay, then you can't see it. So then you have to think about, all right, what other anecdotal opinions do you trust? So I think of, what's Mike seeing? What is TSA seeing? What is TSG seeing? Like all the people who I have good contacts with, who I know are relatively data driven, who pay attention, who have a wide coaching experience. I kind of use that in this overall, like this is the net I should be able to cast. So I want to be able to capture some of those. I don't know if I'd fully call them outliers, but at least like 2 standard deviations from the mean kind of folks, you know. And and that is an inherently subjective decision. Someone might look at my system and go, I don't think you're catching 2 standard deviations from the mean, or I think that's too loose. If you had a periodization purist who was to look at the way I do things, but I think ultimately that's the litmus test. I could give a more specific example if you'd like, but I think philosophically that's probably the way I would recommend almost anybody, whether you're closer to Mike T or closer to a purist, um, I would recommend they land, is be like, you need to figure out, can you find the person who doesn't fit your model but is still within the bounds of what you think is reasonable.
One thing I was going to layer on is that something I always ask myself is like, okay, so the approach we generally take is going to be, sufficient for like that 95% of individuals if we're going with what research tells us kind of thing. Um, while that's clearly the majority, does coaching and especially elite coaching, does that self-select for people who are on the outside ends of the bell curve that would actually make an approach that, although may miss a little bit more on the averages, maybe is going to allow you to detect extreme outliers at a faster rate? I guess that's a question I struggle with sometimes. So like, Mike obviously is going to get the elite of the elite, the people that if you're putting 10 kilos on their total in a year, that is awesome. And he does reliably improves elite athletes' performance.
Mm-hmm.
Does that self-select for the people that are on the far ends of the bell curve, in the sense that maybe we do need to know faster, although maybe you're going to miss on a few more people, that these people really need something significantly different than what we would give to them based on mean data? I don't know. That's just, I have caveats in my own mind, but I'm just going to kick it to you guys, see what you guys think.
I think there's a progression of value and data you can get from anecdote in a coaching career. Early on, when you're not well known, you're going to have a lot more less experienced people who are taking a chance on you. That they may be even framing it that way, because it saves them money, or they know you and they have a personal relationship and they actually feel better about that. That is a higher value to them than the prestige of a coach who might be someone they don't know. Um, and you're gonna have just basically word of mouth, because you won't have a huge online presence, or whatever the equivalent was in 2009 when we started. I guess there was still online presence, just wasn't like Instagram. But anyway, you get a more heterogeneous pool of people coming to you. However, the overall talent level is a little bit lower, and I think this is actually a really good place to be. um, Except it's challenging at first, because you often don't have systems to start. So you end up trying to develop a system from this, and you're being very agile and you're learning the ropes. And if you make it out of that with being successful more often than not, it's probably because you're a good communicator, you paid attention, and you did have enough of an understanding of the evidence, to get people more often than not onto the baseball field. And then you had an eye for individualization. You weren't too dogmatic. Then you get to become an established coach, and this is where there's a door you don't want to enter, because it's the path to stagnation, and that is, now you have an online presence, so you filter people to you, based on already having buy-in or doing something similar to what you preach. And then this creating a positive feedback loop so that your system actually narrows and you're only good at helping people who come to you. And then when people don't fit that mold, they seem like more of an outlier than they really are. And it's much more easy to dismiss that as an outlier. And you just don't become good at coaching other people. And this is not targeting anyone. This is just something that I'm putting out there. I do know certain coaches who seem to only have success with certain types of clients, like the weight class or the sex is, or even the nationality sometimes is all the same, or highly homogenous. And I wonder if that's what's going on in those cases. Um, I think the door you actually want to go into then from that point is to start getting different systems for different types of clients. So it's not just the 3DMJ system, but okay, I've got a silver medalist who's been fighting for gold for 3 years and they're 28 versus someone right off the street versus someone more standard. And having pretty substantial different starts for different types of people. And I think that's where I'm at. Like for working with uh, a new person versus someone who's at a high level, it looks pretty different to start. And I wasn't always like that. And I think that was to my detriment and unfortunately, to my client's detriment. So yeah, I think as you are, once you, we'll use Mike T as an example. He has developed his systems to working with already elite level lifters and getting them more elite. I think that would actually be maybe counterproductive or unnecessarily complex for if he took the exact same approach for someone who is just starting out. I'm not saying he does, but I think being all about chasing individual response and retooling your whole way of looking towards that, towards someone who doesn't really need super individualized training. We don't have direct data on this in resistance training, so small caveat, but there is research on endurance training showing that less well-trained individuals respond just as well to a template program versus an individualized program based on some endurance training metrics. So I would suspect, and it matches the anecdotes I've had, that is also true for people who lift weights. So that's a much, that means you can fix the problem a lot more easily. And you still obviously should chase individualization as things appear. But they are to some degree, quote unquote, different animals, I would say.
Yeah. So 3 sets of 5 for novices. Got it.
Absolutely. That's why starting strength is the right answer for all things.
Absolutely.
So.
Thank you. Okay. I just make sure you confirm my bias there.
All right. We're coming up on time here. So anything to add, fellas, before we wrap up here?
I just want to say I really appreciate the discussion. I think hopefully anyone who listens, this is a very conceptually useful discussion, and it's an honor to be on. Thank you.
I appreciate you taking the time to come on, Dr. Helms.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And do you want to take a second to plug anything for the few people that are hanging on at the end here?
Yeah, so I've got a great new program coming out that is You Get Stronger, and it is a PDF that you can download. It doesn't need to be customized because it works for everyone,
Right.
And it just costs $9.99. And if you're wondering, is that $999 or $9.99? Variable, whichever one you can afford. So yes.
And we'll put the affiliate code in the bio. All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Helms, for joining us today. We really enjoyed it. After the episode with Mike T, Zach and I definitely had some good stuff to chew on and did a bit of an internal audit on the way we systemize.
Gonna have to do it again.
Yeah. So here we go again. So you've kept us busy for the next 4 to 6 weeks for Zach and I to chew on this conversation. If you made it to the end of the podcast, thank you very much for listening. If you're able to leave a rating and review real quick, we'd very much appreciate it. And see you guys next episode. Take care.